So Richard is very kindly joining us from St Andrews, where he's a Professor of Modern History and the Director of the Institute of Intellectual History. His interests include, but are not limited to, early modern and modern intellectual history, theories of empire, democracy and war, Enlightenment and Revolution, and Republican diaspora. And his books include Republicanism and the French Revolution, Against War and Empire, Geneva, Britain and France in the 18th century. So a very apt person, I think, to speak to us on price and the abolition of empire and dangers of enthusiasm. So croeso mawr, a warm welcome to you, Richard.
Thank you again. Apologies for not being there physically. I'm going to rattle through quite a few topics, and obviously you can tell me that I'm wrong because obviously part of the conference it's recovering price, and I can see why we would want to read him for help with solutions to the problems of the present or philosophical problems, etc. But I want to return to Price's own time, because I think, again, you know, what Quentin said about the sense of change and ultimately the sense of failure for the traditions that Price was associated with, especially in politics, was really acute. I also think of Price as somebody who was very practical. So I think when he thought in terms of examples, you know, so obviously like the fact that, you know, there are fewer Marxists since the fall of the Soviet Union, because you have to think, well, what does a Marxist state really look like? For Price, he's looking at what are the real states, what are the examples around him that he wants to draw on use as concrete examples, because I think the practicality of the man really shines through. Now, bringing him back to his own time, what I want to say is that Britain is a very, very peculiar state in the 18th century. And really, especially after the 7 Years' War, very, very few people thought that it was going to survive, especially survive as a free state. And I think that's of fundamental importance, because obviously we think free states are stable. In the 18th century, it's exactly the opposite, partly because most republics are in decline. So if you're thinking of a republican tradition, you might associate it with republics in general, but you're probably more likely to think either of republican confederations, or you're going to think of individual republics that are sovereign. And whether you look at the republican confederations or you look at individual republics, they're in decline. And Pufendorf at the end of the 17th century, and it's a time where, you know, philosophers and historians were relevant to the world because they were expected to predict the future. So it was a glorious time, unlike the present. But he said the future is France. The 18th century is going to be the French century, partly because the unified form of sovereignty meant that it was better able to deal with problems, but more because he thought that it was more suited to a commercial society. And he looked at the contemporary republics and he thinks that they're as chaotic as the German Empire, which was obviously his home, the Holy Roman Empire, which for him was the German Empire. He thought that as a kind of form of confederation, a monarchical confederation, was in chaos, was in a terrible state. And he thought the contemporary republics, especially the Dutch and the Swiss Confederation, they're also in decline. And really, republics in the 18th century, they're seen as states that are fighting for their survival. They're not likely to be able to survive. They're too small, and they can't cope with the forces of chaos that are represented by commerce. Now, Britain as a free state has its own chaotic history. And the other thing to say about the creation of republics is creating a republic is creating a church. And that's how they thought about it in the 18th century. We tend not to. But that means that if you create a church, there's a danger that you're going to fall prey to all the problems of enthusiasm, fanaticism, and superstition that they had experienced in times of Reformation. And it's also something you need to think about when you think about democracy, because if democracy becomes a fanatic church with a fanatic populace subject to frenzy, then obviously it's not going to be stable. And actually, you don't want to embrace it. And obviously, for contemporary Europeans, they've got all of the experience of the Reformation. And we think of the Reformation as something that's way back. But actually, in terms of the 18th century, it's still the case that I think they would have thought of the Reformation and wars of religion as you know, likely to break out obviously many people thought Louis XIV had attempted to counter-reformation, to reignite the counter-reformation when he's attempting to create a universal monarchy. And therefore, Britain is not seen to be a state that is necessarily has a stable history. Obviously, it certainly doesn't have a stable history in the 17th century with the wars of the three kingdoms. And it's an odd free state, but nevertheless, it is a free state. But it's a free state that seems to be addicted to commerce and war. And that's really what marks it out. And for contemporaries, again, at different times in the 18th century, people are more or less optimistic about the possibility of Britain maintaining itself as a free state. But it seems to be the case that Britain likes to fight other states. And if you think of the 1790s, it really ends, the century ends in liberty wars. You know, the two major free states, obviously the new free state of France and Britain, fighting each other in the name of liberty to the death. So the assumption that kind of, you know, free states are pacific because they're commercial, I think in the 18th century, it's really, it's mythical. It's something you can project in ideal circumstances, but it's not really a reality. So the way that I think Price, especially after the 7 Years' War, when he becomes associated most directly with Shelburne, and Shelburne puts together a circle of brilliant intellectuals and philosophers, because he thinks he's going to come to power. And obviously he does come to power. He puts an end to the American wars, and he establishes the peace. But he's only in power for a very short period of time, and he draws on Price. I mean, Price is very, very close to him, and they work together, partly because they think that Shelburne's going to come back into power. Again, we've talked about William Pitt the Younger. He's Shelburne's protege. The expectation that when Pitt gets power himself, then he will draw on Shelburne and Price as well. So they're very, very close to power. And I think that for a short period of time, Price's expectation is that he can really change the world. And you have to change the world if you're somebody like Price, if you're going to put an end to the crisis that I call the end of Enlightenment. And what it means is, it means that wars of religion are breaking out again. And they're breaking out again, but they're breaking out again in the secular world, whereas in the past, obviously, they're associated with religious ideologies. And I define Enlightenment as whatever strategy puts an end to wars of religion. So it could be autocratic solution, to force people into certain forms of behavior that are going to prevent them from turning fanatic, and therefore likely to foment wars of religion. Or somehow you might be able to do it in the context of a free state. And that becomes really the fundamental problem, especially when you think that Britain is in crisis. And I think for Price and for Shelburne, Britain is in crisis because it's an unnatural state. It really shouldn't be as great as it is. It's only great because of its reliance on public credit. The debt's enormous. It's addicted to war and really paying for war by future generations paying for it because of the system of public credit. That generates forms of commerce. And the reason that people like Price and Shelburne loved Adam Smith is because of his idea of the mercantile system. The mercantile system, which obviously is a nexus really of merchants and bankers who bribe politicians because of the enormous wealth that they've often generated from empire. And they persuade the politicians to pass legislation for the mercantile system in the interests of the mercantile figures rather than for the public good. So the public good's been abandoned. And obviously they see this in India. They see it particularly in Ireland. So Ireland and India are two of the places that they see supporting and maintaining the mercantile system. And for a very short period of time, they think they can get rid of it. And they draw really on Hume. I mean, I think obviously Quentin mentioned it as well, that Hume's behind so many of Price's politics, because Hume is one of the people who says, after the 7 Years' War, Britain has become a state where fanaticism is breaking out afresh. It exists in the form of an addiction to empire, an addiction to war-financed empire, and obviously his friend Smith as using the term the mercantile system to describe the polity. They're also obviously worried about the excessive powers of George III because they think that he's a different kind of monarch, but they also think that he's in cahoots with the mercantile system, and that's another thing that you have to worry about. So there's forms of fanaticism, and they also are worried about the people because they think that the British populace is also fanatic. Obviously, you see it with the Gordon riots, the hatred of Catholics, but for Hume particularly, and obviously it's passed on to Price and to Shelburne, even though sometimes they are themselves, especially when they're talking about Scottish people, they're unbelievably rude and xenophobic themselves. But Hume's vision really was of civilized monarchies, and obviously we've heard the phrase before in some of the papers, characterized by governments of laws rather than men. So if you have a sense of a public good that it's adhered to, it's embodied in the law, then actually you're going to have a civilized monarchy, which is nevertheless a free state because liberties are protected. And it means that you're going to have potentially a Pacific Europe rather than this Europe addicted to war and empire. And obviously Hume hates xenophobia. He's a Francophile. In the 1750s, he's optimistic, but then it all crashes with the 7 Years' War. And after that, he sees xenophobia, and he thinks xenophobia, when you have communities that are based on the social glue of hate, you know, I suppose rather than more positive forces, where cosmopolitan forces, where people might actually be kind and generous to one another. If you've got communities based on hate, which is sometimes necessary when you've got wars going on, then he thinks that characterizes Britain. Now, I think that really is exactly what Price and Shelburne accept in the 1770s and 1780s. Obviously, they think Britain's collapsing. The empire has been proved to be a corrupt empire, and thank goodness for the American Revolution, because it shows that their diagnoses prove that fanatic polities addicted to war and empire cannot last. And that means there's an opportunity, and that's why they work so hard on the peace. The peace deal in 1783 includes commercial treaties, which the idea is that that's going to be able to maintain peace into the future. And the hope really is that Britain, as a contemporary Carthage, like ancient Carthage, it'll be defeated in war. And actually, I think that's quite a positive thing, because both Shelburne and Price think that Britain's too big. The empire is excessive. It's a corrupt commercial empire. It doesn't really do anything for the people. It corrupts politics. It means that you can't have a state that's characterized by the governance of laws rather than men. And it means all of your strategies for reform are going to fail unless you deal with this fundamental problem, which is renewed fanaticism in the body politic. But obviously it fails. They fail. Shelburne doesn't come back to power. Price then is part of a chorus of people who think Britain's doomed. You know, Britain will collapse. And actually, it might be a good thing if it does, because it'll show how dreadful this so-called free state really is, especially given the way that it behaves to the Irish and to India, and has done in the case of the new United States as well. So we come to the French Revolution, and obviously it's been said that Price thinks that the French Revolution is obviously a very good thing, and of course he does. Obviously, he thinks it's a version of 1688, except it'll be a version of 1688 that works, rather than the unglorious revolution that actually didn't solve the problem of Britain and didn't create a free state that was likely to maintain itself. But the real letdown of the French Revolution, which obviously Price, because obviously he dies in 91, he doesn't he doesn't live to see. And he dies. He's one of the very few people during this period who dies relatively content. And I do think, again, it's been said in the commentary earlier, it's because of his apocalyptic millenarianism. He is optimistic that at least when you die, you leave Babylon and you go to paradise. And at some point, obviously, God will intervene on earth and restore paradise. And if it is characterized by Babylon, then so be it. But if you look at the real tragedy of the French Revolution, is that it's an experiment in creating a free state based on so-called positive forms of patriotism. You know, initially with the French Revolution, they abolish offensive war, obviously the basis on the system of rights, endless speculation about a better future. But actually, it falls to the standard Republican story, which is popular states go through a phase of everybody getting on with each other, and then they collapse into factions that fight one another, and then someone needs to restore order, and hey presto, there's a Republican general in the wings that you actually give power to. They claim to embody the revolution, and they turn themselves into an empire figure. So I don't think that the French Revolution is that special in terms of the history of political thought, because it ended up being a standard Republican revolution, really proving that republicanism was a doctrine that was in trouble. Obviously, there's endless speculation, especially in France, about how you can save republics, and ultimately some of the Republicans argue that the only way you can have a proper republic is by having moderate wealth for all. And obviously that's part of the so-called Republican political economy of the 1790s. But I think the real shock, and I think Shelburne sees it, obviously Price doesn't see it, but it's nevertheless would have been an enormous shock, which is that mercantile systems are able to maintain themselves. And that's the real lesson of the 18th century in terms of politics, that Britain actually survives as a state. As I say, nobody expected it. A lot of people, you know, think, oh, Montesquieu was an Anglophile, or Voltaire. They never think Britain's a model. But by the following generation, former Republicans, you know, radical Republicans, Madame de Stael, Benjamin Constant, Sismondi, all of the new generation of liberals, what do they say? Britain has to be the model. But the big problem for them is that Britain's a mercantile system where the politics are corrupted by the forms of dominion that are established by commercial companies with their influence over politicians, who then don't pass legislation for the public good. And that becomes the problem for the next generation. And it's a problem that Price was never able to solve, because his great hope was that mercantile systems are self-defeating, because ultimately they collapse in war. And the tragedy is that figures like Pitt were able to generate xenophobic patriotism to the extent that the people supported the war and they condemned figures like Price. And I just want to very, very briefly, obviously you've seen the print with Burke smelling out a rat, the atheistical revolutionist that is Price, disturbed in his midnight calculations, obviously significant. I'll just very quickly, it'll only take me a minute, show you another couple of prints, so that if you could go to the next one, please, Hugh. Now, this is Charles James Fox, and obviously he looks like the Christian pilgrim, but it's showing that it's called the Slough of Despond, and it is really showing that all of the notions of reform, of republics, of republican harmony have got mired in the dirt, and liberty is somewhere that he's never going to get to. And if you could just show the next one, is a print from 1784 that really shows that the frenzy of the people. If you see on the right hand side, they're worried about that. George III is tugging at the frenzy of the people, which obviously means, you know, popular fanaticism, popular patriotism, xenophobic patriotism, and it's destroying the constitution. It's destroying Britannia. And Price is actually listed as one of the Whigs who would support this. And the very last one, and it's where I'll stop, is it's called The Apples and Horse Turds. It's from 1800. It's another Gilray print, but Price is actually one of the turds. And the point is that that republics and republicans and all the advocates of republican liberty have ended up on a dunghill because the French Revolution has failed. And all of the states of the world are apples. They are the pippins. And you have Bonaparte, who's obviously become the exponent. He's the outcome that you get from Price's reform. You have to cope with how do you avoid a Republican general who claims to rule in the name of the people. And Bonaparte is about to eat up all of the apples. So the expectation is at least Britain as a free state doesn't collapse into another Cromwell, another emperor figure, but it has its own problem in the form of the mercantile system. So I've gone at very high speed and covered a lot. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. We know the drill by now. I'll just see if there are any questions from the audience in the room here first, and if you're part of the virtual audience, please raise your hands or pop queries into the chat. It looks like stunned silence here, Richard. You've quieted them down. Does anybody want to ask a question, Richard? I'll just see if there are any queries coming through on the chat. Oh, here we go. So Malcolm has raised a hand. Malcolm, if you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Well, it's two very short things. I mean, first of all, did Price imagine that the French king would be removed very soon, in 2 years? I mean, when he welcomed, that's my first question, is when he welcomed the revolution, did he ever imagine that it would result in the removal of the monarch rather than in a reformed monarchy? And secondly, he was certainly wrong about the end of empire and mercantile and all the things you're describing, because also in the 1790s, this was a period where Great Britain in India established its rising supremacy. After the French nearly wiped out the British at the time of the American War of Independence in the 1780s, which of course you would have seen. In the 1790s, thanks to Warren Hastings and other people, the British established their supremacy over other colonial powers, and in particular over the French. So that was something he didn't see, and maybe he was not expecting the disappearance of the French monarch either.
Yeah, I don't think he necessarily was expecting regicide. Obviously, the thing about Burke is that a lot of people thought that, you know, Burke's reflections made him a seer because he predicted the horrors of the French Revolution and it seemed to come to pass. But from Burke's perspective, his book was completely wrong. Within a couple of years, he thinks it's wrong, because the French Revolution as well is supremely, the revolutionary forces, especially when it's turned into a republic, is supremely good at war. And so Burke dies really despondent himself. And obviously, what's Burke's solution? War to the death against revolutionary France. You know, people say Burke's conservative. No, he isn't. He doesn't want to conserve anything. He'll do anything to destroy revolutionary France. So he's the mirror image of Paine, who says you need a war to the death against Britain to cut the cancer of the mercantile system, which is preventing the French Revolution from succeeding. So I think obviously Price dies before then. Like Shelburne, who knows what he would have thought, but I think he would have thought that the tragedy of the world is that communities are established on the basis of, let's call it negative liberty. But negative liberty means it's on the basis of hate. So that's the social glue, and it's more successful than a positive liberty of love, I suppose. And obviously Price is somebody who wants to create communities that are positive, and ultimately the negative community wins through. And that's how he thinks of the British in India. Actually, he's talking about the British in India with Shelburne, you know, in the 1770s. It's one of their obsessions that they're fascinated by, and obviously they're opponents of Hastings, and they support Burke with the impeachment of Hastings, but they think it's part of a mercantile system that can't maintain itself because it's a corrupt economy. So if corrupt economies can't maintain themselves, you might have a future of liberty. But with Britain's success, and then it becomes a model state for everybody else, corrupt economies are able to maintain themselves. And I think the notion of a fanatic economy, the notion of a mercantile system, they're notions that we should draw on, because actually, if you look at the way that lots of corporations and the lobbyists, etc., behave, I think, you know, Price would have the diagnosis, the Smithian diagnosis, but the problem is that they are able to maintain themselves.
Well, I mean, the East India Company was able to maintain itself, but of course, eventually the British state took over the East India Company, and thereby, of course, again, refuting Price's expectations, because it turned out to be a very successful regime in India, at least well into the 20th century.
Well, again, there's a whole history of attempts to say that in the 19th century that mercantile systems are not mercantile systems because they're based on, you know, spreading common law and notions of trust. So the British hold an empire, parts of the empire, in trust until the indigenous peoples are ready for self-government. And obviously that becomes the justification of India, of the rule of India. But I mean, from a kind of critical perspective, many people would have said, well, it's still a mercantile system for the benefit of financial and political elites mainly based in London. So there's an endless argument about the mercantile system and what's a mercantile system and how they operate, but it's really post-Price. And for Price, the really sad thing is that he thought history was on his side. You know, bad things collapse. And unfortunately, at least in terms of the mercantile empire and mercantile system, the bad thing was able to maintain itself, and actually, because it's so good at war, become democratic, you know, with the support of a xenophobic populace. So you just have to say, oh, blame this group or that group or the other, and they'll vote for your demagogue, your projector, who sells them moonshine. And I think the aim of the science of the statesman or legislator that Price was involved in, it assumed that that fanatic world was not going to become the dominant form of state, let's say. But that is the history of Britain. And Britain, as I've said, becomes a model with the Belt and Road, with China. It's still the model, the good old mercantile system. Being very prepared for war if necessary. It means small states lose out. You know, this is not a world of small states. All the republics actually are eaten up by the French revolutionaries in the 1790s anyway. So it's significant that this is what happened, and that's the way I think we should see, you know, Price's politics and after, I suppose.
Thanks, Richard. Can I ask of you, well, actually, I'll get to the question in a moment. I suppose one of the interesting things that came from your talk there, in terms of this picture, I suppose, the conference is trying to build up of Price, you know, in the round, as it were, is the element of his influence on politics, and that's not perhaps something that's been brought to the fore. And it's an interesting reminder in a way, where you started there about how Price was, in the inner circle with Shelburne and so forth, and that we can see him not only as a, public intellectual and a philosopher, but also somebody who was, moving and shaking, as it were. So that struck me in terms of how you've presented Price and his place within the second half of the 18th century. Moving on to your analysis, the question that comes to my mind is how we might read Discourse on the Love of Our Country in the context of that analysis, because, from what you've just said, it strikes me that in a way, it would be possible perhaps to read that text as a kind of response to the malaise that you've described. And, what's interesting there is, it's about how we should love our country, how can we legitimately be patriots, if you like. And obviously the ideas he puts forward are all about, patriotism that is in some ways restricted by our cosmopolitanism. He wants to move away from chauvinism, that we shouldn't, loving our country does not mean, as it were, being in competition or in war with others. It doesn't mean that we should look down upon others. And also as well, of course, you get those very powerful passages on war. But what struck me then in terms of this emphasis on mercantilism is that I would say, I might have to go back to the text, that there's very little sort of political economy, if you like, in that text. So I was just wondering on your thoughts on that in terms of, that picture that you presented of to us of Price and how we might see him in that broader, sweeping kind of historical context. Would we be right to read a Discourse on the Love of Our Country in terms of some of these elements that you set out? And if so, where's the political economy gone? Because as we heard in the presentations before lunch, there's actually quite a lot of political economy you can draw out of Price, but it's not something that maybe he puts front and centre in those more kind of political pamphlets.
I think that we have a distinction between categories, political economy, politics, international relations. And in the 18th century, when you think about one, you think about all of them, because if you're going to solve a problem, you've got to deal with all of the aspects of a problem. So, and because communities are inherently international, because they accept the global nature of commerce and the nature of commercial society, then he is thinking about it all the time. Obviously, in The Love of Country, it's a tract for a particular time. And he, all of a sudden, it's another instance of the very tiny period of time in his life when he thought history was on his side, as in when Shelburne is in power. And he thinks that what Shelburne has done with the peace, creating these commercial relationships between powers that are pacific and not having a monstrous peace and not preparing for future war, then the French Revolution is a time when all the nations can come together and you can abolish mercantile empire and you can abolish war. And getting rid of war, I think, is the most important thing. And war obviously exists between nations, but it also exists between communities, as you've implied. And obviously, the notion of a patriotism that is a cosmopolitan patriotism. The irony is, Europe's about to experience nearly 25 years of war, not long after Price finishes the text, and then unfortunately dies. So it's the case that the political economy they're always thinking about it, because everything is tied together. That's the way that they think about the world. So I don't think of a text as it's about politics, because for them it just wouldn't make any sense. But the terrible thing is that obviously war didn't stop. Even though he had high hopes that it might. That seemed to be the message of the French Revolution. Again, Britain, it shows Britain's an inferior state, it'll decline, and we'll have a better world in consequence.
Thank you. So would that mean that the sort of contemporary reader would potentially be sort of reading into the text the sort of implicit political economy that was part of the wider discussion, so that, when Price was making these arguments and perhaps making these references that are too nuanced perhaps for the contemporary eye, that at that time you know, people would have understood those arguments in the wider context. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting. I might note as well, you mentioned sort of one of the themes of the conference being the sense of, you know, price's relevance. Unfortunately, you know, these discussions about xenophobia and conflict and war, of course, are all the more current, and in particular, you know, enthusiasm, fanaticism, that really has come to perhaps distinguish our political age, hasn't it? And that's also perhaps striking in terms of the presentation you've given today.
I mean, well, we've never been able to get rid of the mercantile system. That's the problem. I mean, even this morning, you know, the head of Shell is saying, oh, well, I might move the off the head if the British threaten to reduce, obviously, oil exploration, then we'll move the offices to the US, where they're much more receptive. Standard mercantile system, all of it, and that's the part. And they had the diagnosis, you know, they knew exactly what's going on. Until you actually deal with that, they didn't think you were ever going to have the politics of the public good and republicanism in the sense of the res publica, you know, which they also thought they'd lost. So again, Britain as a free state, it's an ambiguous model, has very positive elements, but a lot of negatives.
Great, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I think we'll move on to the second presentation for this session, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us to St Andrews.